Hello, my name is Cody Reinhardt, and my presentation is Sapkowski's Witcher as an expose of Adam Smith's Impartial Spectator. It's a shame that we can't be in the same room and have a face-to-face conference, but given that we're in a digital format, let's do the best we can. This paper is also in a very early state, and so any and all comments and suggestions and feedback are welcome, and I've got my information here on the screen now. I'll also leave it in the description of the video if you need to find it later. As a brief outline, we'll look at Adam Smith's Impartial Spectator and the underlying philosophy. We'll have a background for The Witcher, so even if you aren't familiar with The Witcher or don't quite know what it is, you will, and we'll get you up to speed with that. And then we'll look at connections and examples and explain why I think there's a big underlying philosophical tie between both The Witcher and the Impartial Spectator. Adam Smith is most well known for his work in The Wealth of Nations and in economics, but before he wrote The Wealth of Nations, Smith wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments. In it, he describes a spectator, or an entity that exists outside of us that's going to pass judgment on our actions and emotions and responses. Now, spectator theory wasn't new to Smith or new to the theory of moral sentiments. It was developed by several Scottish empiricists and philosophers, starting with Francis Hutcheson, David Hume, and finally Smith, who had the last say, chronologically speaking, on this spectator. And to exemplify what the spectator is, I'll use the earthquake story, probably the most famous and maybe most misinterpreted stories from the theory of moral sentiments. So in the earthquake story, Smith is going to describe an individual in Europe who learns news of a great tragedy on the other side of the world, an earthquake. And in it, many people have perished. And so this individual is going to express sorrow and not feel good about the situation. He might also consider what effects this has on the market. But at the end of the day, he's going to sleep soundly at night. Right? He wasn't personally affected in any way. In contrast, the same individual, if he learned that he was going to lose his little finger, right, wouldn't sleep at night. Right? That's the background for this earthquake story. And so the idea was that how is the individual going to value the well-being or utility of others in relation to his or her own utility, right? How could it be that this little finger is going to outweigh in a moral judgment the lives of many other people? Right? And I say that this is often used out of context actually as a criticism of Smith's overall work and his idea of self-interest in the market. But Smith continues and says that there is something, right? There is an idea which prompts us to sacrifice our own interest to the greater interests of others. He says, is reason, principle, conscious, the inhabitant of the breast, the man within, the great judge and arbiter of our conduct. Right? This is going to be this spectator, this idea that we can think beyond our own personal situation using the concept of the spectator to understand the situation in an impartial way. And so this impartial spectator is going to view a situation and a circumstance with themselves in place of the agent. Right? So you observe an agent, they are in a situation and then they conduct maybe some actions, they have emotions or responses to their situation, and it's going to be judged by a comparison of what the impartial spectator would do. So as a spectator, I might put myself in the situation of someone else and say, well, what did they do and what would I do, right, as somebody impartial? And should their actions and their emotions match with what I would expect, then that means that I would approve or disapprove of their actions. Right? The consideration of what he himself would feel if he was reduced to the same unhappy situation and was at the same time able to regard it with his present reason and judgment. And so there are several examples here of situations where we're asked to be an impartial spectator. We're asked to put ourselves in the situation of somebody else or put ourselves in a situation where we have to remove any information personal to us and look at it in an impartial or unbiased way. And the extent to which we're granted the ability to judge or accepted to be an adequate judge of the situation depends on the information that we have at hand and how we consider it. So in a court case, the jury is presented with lots of information from both the prosecution and the defense. And the idea is that they're meant to be collectively a judge of the conduct, of the emotions, of the response of the agent. As a researcher, we're also tasked to gather information and gather resources and data, use previous research when we have a novel academic problem. And the extent of information that we have and the extent of information that we use determines how much of a judge we're allowed to be, or how well we do as this impartial spectator in the situation. Now, the impartial spectator serves another purpose other than the spectator judging the agent themselves. The agent can also conjure this idea of the impartial spectator in their own situation. So if I'm the agent and I'm in a moral dilemma, some sort of situation, I can imagine an impartial spectator and how they might react in my situation. And if I imagine somebody, some great judge who was in my situation and they're going to react differently than I am, then I can temper my passions, in the words of Smith, to that of somebody with impartial and privy to full information. Right, so the individual or the agent is constantly led to imagine in what manner he would be affected if he was only one of the spectators of his own situation. Right, and so this serves a dual purpose in that even the agent can imagine the spectator in their own situation. Next, let's move on to a background for The Witcher. So The Witcher was written by a Polish author, Andrzej Sapkowski. It sold millions of copies of the books, which were written first. Then they were turned into a video game series with many millions of copies sold, one of the most successful video game franchises. And then this also spawned a Netflix series. So some of you might have been introduced to The Witcher through the Netflix series. In just a couple of weeks, the second season will be coming out. Now, the Witcher universe is set in a medieval fantasy setting. So there's magic and monsters, curses, swords, dragons. And what sets it apart from other medieval fantasy universes, such as in Tolkien or in Game of Thrones, is it's strongly based on Eastern European folklore and Polish children's stories and things like that. There's many similarities there. Even some of the names of the monsters match with names of these sort of folklore beasts. So here, just as an introduction, if you haven't seen it before, this is a picture of the main protagonist in the Witcher series, and he's, in this case, in one of the video games, facing down a interesting monster, this giant toad, who is sentient, and actually there's quite interesting interaction between the two of them. So what is a Witcher? The namesake of the story. So Witchers are humans, typically orphaned, who undergo mutations, trials, and training, and eventually become monster hunters. And in this universe, they have enhanced abilities, so strength and speed, superhuman strength and speed. Notably, and most emphasized, is their perception, as well as extensive knowledge and training about monsters and curses and magic and different things they might encounter. Now, the Witchers are nomadic. They're not affiliated with any of the countries or regions of the world, politics, places, or people. So typically they have no personal stake in the outcome of a situation when they arrive and are passing judgment or solving a situation. Which means they become great candidates for our impartial spectator. So as a philosophical experiment, what would happen if we take Smith's impartial spectator and the philosophy and ideas of that and create a story where the spectator is the main character? So rather than a hero who is good and he is fighting against evil and people that are bad, the impartial spectator inhabits a world of moral conflicts, right? Lots of different groups, lots of individuals that they meet, and there are conflicts between them, situations and moral dilemmas, and it's the Witcher's job, as they're there, to pass judgment or react in some way to these situations. Right? Again, they have no ties to organizations or interest groups, right? This is the impartial part. They have these supernatural senses, perception, and knowledge. So often, when there's a situation that arises in the books, a Witcher is kind of needed because the people that are trying to handle the situation are unable to find the correct information or knowledge and become an adequate judge. And so the Witcher's ability to judge, again, just like the impartial spectator, based on their amount of information. Right? They're going to be perceptive, investigate, gather information, do so in a way beyond that of a normal inhabitant in the world. So here's a scene from the first season of the Netflix series for The Witcher. In this scene, The Witcher has accompanied a friend to a party, and at this party, it's a royal banquet. The princess is to be married to a suitor, and there's many suitors from many kingdoms who want to marry the princess and form an alliance with this kingdom called Centra. And the queen is here, so there's a queen, but no king in this kingdom right now. And when the Witcher arrives, she's quite happy that he's there because she knows in this situation there's going to be some conflict and some moral dilemmas. And so she's glad he is there to help pass judgment and make sure the situation is resolved at the end. And he's given a seat when he arrives on the right side of the throne. So she's there sitting in the throne, and he's given the best seat in the banquet hall right to the right. And in this scene, there ends up being quite a significant moral dilemma. A new suitor arrives outside of the kingdoms that were sort of promised a spot at the banquet, and the suitor wants the princess's hand. Now, everybody there immediately is called to arms, and there's a conflict that arises because they all have a personal interest in becoming the suitor and having their kingdom be the one to gain the alliance. And it's only the Witcher that's able to stop the conflict and resolve the moral dilemma of whether or not this suitor deserves a place or a chance to compete for the princess's hand. And so he's there to pass judgment. Now, he doesn't live in Centra, and he has no stake in this situation, but he is there as a impartial spectator, observes a situation or a moral dilemma occur, and then his reaction allows the problem to be resolved, right, in a way that it would not be if he was not there. There's also a link between both the agent and the spectator. So we discussed this dual purpose of the impartial spectator, both the spectator judging the agent as well as the agent able to imagine the impartial spectator and then temper their reactions and emotions to their situations. Now, how this relates back to The Witcher is that there's a Witcher code that prevents them from working for free. So they're monster hunters for hire, but when they go and they visit a village who has been plagued by a monster problem or there's maybe a curse, they don't work for free. So they have a price that they charge given the situation. And in the video games, there's a mechanic where you actually bargain for the proper payment and you create a contract. Right? And so the agent is forced to imagine the impartial spectator and understand, well, what is the severity or importance of this situation from the perspective of the spectator, and how much compensation should they be given. Right? Bargaining forces this agent to confront a value as assessed by others, or as assessed by this impartial spectator. So of course, if they are in this moral situation and the Witcher arrives, they would like the Witcher to help, but it's not just the hero coming to save the day. It's the individual has to think, okay, well, what is the value to the Witcher? What would the Witcher think of this situation, and what value do they assess? And in that way, they're able to use the idea of the impartial spectator to set a price. And so here's a scene from the video games. There's a little slider. And as the Witcher, if you actually ask for too much money, they get annoyed and say, well, might not have that. But you're negotiating. Right? So there's a base rate that you'll be paid, and then you are asking for more maybe in compensation. And so this bargaining allows the agent, so the person with the contract, to come up with an idea of what does the impartial spectator see in this situation rather than just their own personal situation. Right, so Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments has had a lot of influence on modern stories and modern media. Right, so modern media is going to be drawing from Smith, so particularly with Sapkowski's Witcher. And the popularity, at least is in part due to this moral exploration of the impartial spectator, right? So one of the reasons that The Witcher has become popular is that it is not like other stories where you have a Superman-esque hero, a good guy fighting evil. There's this demand for Smith's philosophy, this demand for this idea of the impartial spectator and how they view the world, and how agents or individuals that are not the impartial spectator can still use the idea to think about their own situation. And the storytelling format, so using The Witcher, allows for a deeper exploration and understanding of Smith's ideas. So, for example, in the classroom, when I teach the history of economic thought, I like to use stories or examples that students can relate to, as a way for exploring the ideas. So, exploring both the philosophy and the text and the work of Smith, and then also using another story or comparison to further help the students understand the idea. And so there's sort of this mutual benefit of both looking at Smith's work and allowing us to do that in the context of a modern story. And here I have some citations, a short list of the citations so far. So if you have any comments or feedback or suggestions for the paper, I'd be happy to hear it. And I look forward to seeing everyone else's presentations and discussions throughout the weekend.